thank you to everybody for coming. Michael introduced me by name. For those who might, in a spirit of full inclusion, I'd like to also do a visual introduction of myself. Rebecca, I'm a white woman in mid-60s with curly hair that's pulled back today, large framed glasses, wearing a necklace made out of some seeds and beads. Wearing a black top, and behind me is a scene from a park in New York City in Swindler's Cove, which is on the east side of Washington Heights, across from Harlem. And let me begin now, and that's a protocol I enjoy to use to welcome inclusion. Another one is to please invite everyone who might want to use closed caption to look at the below, and you can actually access closed captioning if you prefer to read as we speak. So I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement, in addition to thanking Michael for getting things going, and a recognition that we had a rule change today with CUNY, and we now have passcodes to get into all webinars. So if you have friends who are trying to get in, send them the webinar code that you had to use, 055974. But that's a little housekeeping. I really want to acknowledge the land we sit on. I am in a place that was originally stewarded by the Canarsie people, also the Lenape. And I wanted to recognize that, since so much of the land that we are functioning on was unceded and taken. But I want to also acknowledge the Haudenosaunee people who came from just a little north of us, about 100 or 200 miles north of where I sit. And the Haudenosaunee also were referred to as the Six Nations. And they established that in their rule of operating, decisions are made based on how you consider the seventh generation forward. So I wanted to really recognize the seventh generation who is not in the room today as we think about them. And I also want to honor ancestors who we may carry with us as we go forward in all we do, what makes us strong, the shoulders we stand upon. So thank you for that. One of the songs we listened to when we were gathering and holding the space is Patti Smith, "The Power to Dream, the Power to Rule, the Power to Wrestle Us from the Fools." And I want to encourage us to think about that. And if you enjoyed it and even got up and danced while it was playing, good for you. So last month here at SLU, School of Labor and Urban Studies, we hosted a talk with Juan Gonzalez. Many of you know him as a Puerto Rican journalist, currently on Democracy Now! And the name of his talk was 50 Years of Struggle. And I thought that's so important, that he was looking back 50 years, and today we're going to look forward 50 years. And the book that Emmy and Iman wrote really helps us look forward 50 years. It's saying, what happens if? So I'm going to ask them to speak a lot and really help with that. Because as things break down, I often say, how do we live into the future? So Michael mentioned that we have something called the Community and Worker Ownership Project here at the school, which launched a graduate certificate program, Workplace Democracy and Community Ownership. Both of those have the word ownership in it. When we were designing it, some of us didn't feel comfortable about that, because actually we are stewards. We are stewards. And maybe in some future way, we can talk about community and worker stewardship, because those who own the means are some of those fools that Patti Smith talks about us, wrestle with them. But the stories in the book and Everything for Everyone really helps us look at how things get wrestled. So I wanted us to really hear a lot about that, and think in not only what we teach at the school, but as social justice activists, which most of us come to this space with that. What do we build while we resist? And there's a lot that we're resisting, but we're also building. Some of us refer to this as solidarity economy, solidarity economics, cooperative economics. There's lots of different terms that get used, post-capitalism, non-reformist reform. But as we think about what we build, how do we do it? These stories that are being brought to us from the future, I really want to thank our speakers and authors and oral historians. So let me turn to them. I'm going to introduce them with their bios and invite them to actually then come on and talk about the book. So Iman Abdalhadi is an academic activist who writes and thinks at the intersection of identity, politics, sexuality, and gender. Her academic work has been published in numerous peer-reviewed journals and covered by press outlets such as Washington Post, Associated Press, and NPR. She is a poet and an essayist, as well as a co-author of Everything for Everyone, published just this summer. She received her PhD in sociology from NYU in 2019 and is currently an assistant professor at the University of Chicago. Emmy O'Brien writes and speaks on gender freedom and capitalism. She co-authored this novel, Everything for Everyone. Her second book, Family Abolition, Capitalism and the Communization of Care, will be out with Pluto Press in June of this year. She co-edits 2 magazines, Pinko on gay communism and Parapraxis on psychoanalytic theory and politics. Her work on family abolition has been translated into Chinese, German, Greek, French, Spanish, and Turkish. And her writing has been published by Work, Employment and Society, Social Movement Studies, Endnotes, Comintern, Commune, and Invert. I believe the authors met in graduate school and took their friendship and comradeship all the way to this current moment, and dare I say 50 years from now as well. So let me turn to each of you, invite each of you to introduce yourself, both with a visual introduction for those who may not be using, who might appreciate the visual support, and then talk a little bit about how you came to write this book. Iman?
Hi, yeah, so thank you so much, Rebecca, for having us, and for all of the wonderful folks making the Zoom run. I just, as a visual descriptor, so as Rebecca said, I'm Iman Abdelhadi, and as a visual descriptor, I am a Middle Eastern woman in my early 30s, with dramatic eyeliner and lipstick as usual, and shoulder length curly hair. I'm wearing a red shirt and a gold pendant, and I'm sitting in an office in front of some plants, some books, and a whiteboard with many, many words on it. So it's wonderful to be here. Thank you.
My name is Emmy O'Brien. I use she and her pronouns, I think this sounds like a good practice and a good thing to learn and do. I often rely on the kind of ambiguity of how people see me and what people perceive me as. So this is a very interesting exercise. I'm a white, soft-butch trans woman in my mid-40s. I have red hair and wearing a white professional shirt and a black wool sweater. And I'm sitting in front of a white privacy screen. Yeah.
Thank you. Great practice.
Yeah, thank you.
Inclusion happens in so many little ways. So may I welcome everybody. And let's start with this. I'm so curious how you came to this, coming together to write stories as oral historians 50 years from now.
That sounds like your kind of question, man. I could talk about the book after you talk about some about its history.
Sure. Yeah, so I like to say that this book is a culmination of 10 years of friendship. So Michelle and I, or Emmy and I, met in graduate school at NYU and became fast friends. And neighbors. So we lived 1 block away from each other in Flatbush in Brooklyn. And so we began talking a lot about communism, about politics, about theory, and about sci-fi. So Emmy always blushes when I say that I consider her one of my political teachers, but I really learned a lot in the course of this friendship, and learned a lot about sci-fi. Became a sci-fi fan as a result of this of our many conversations. At the same time, we were both separately developing a relationship with oral history. For me, oral history was was something I was training in to do as my sociological research. So that my dissertation, my first academic book, which is underway, rely on life history interviews or oral histories. And Emmy was working at the New York City Public Library's Trans Oral History Project, and in fact ran it for several years. It's really an amazing project, and I would encourage folks to check out some of the interviews. So we were both developing this sort of independent relationship with oral history, and all of the, and you know, we already knew that we had very aligned politics and ideas of the future, and had you know 10 years of conversation. Emmy wrote a speculative fictional oral history for an online magazine a few years ago, and then she invited me to work with her on a project for the novel. And we kind of thought, you know, we thought there'd be like, you know, maybe a couple dozen people in the world who'd want to read our weird little novel. And, you know, we looked, you know, we thought about a press that was aligned with our values and was, you know, would be excited about it. We reached out to Common Notions, which is based in Brooklyn. And I see that our editor, who's incredible, is in the audience today. So yeah, we just reached out to them. We wrote a proposal. They were interested in the book, and we wrote it.
Great.
I'll say a little bit about the premise of the book. So it's set in 2072, 20 years after a kind of global insurrection and anti-capitalist struggle sort of has reached New York, and over it documents this kind of 20-year revolutionary period. And me and a man are characters in the book, and we are each conducting oral history interviews with a diverse range of people who played various roles in the struggle. And their roles are quite diverse, that they are organizers, they are young people sort of growing up in the aftermath of the revolution. And the oral history form was really very helpful. One, it's much easier for us to write, engaging it a lot, but it also really helped us kind of bridge thinking about macro social forces, a person's personal account of their life, their psychological trauma and healing, and how they have struggled with that, their social relationships with other people. And as an account of revolution goes, it places a considerable emphasis on social reproduction, on kind of the strategies of collective survival that people forge in the midst of protracted social crisis, and those strategies of collective survival becoming the basis of a kind of new society. And sort of looking at how that transforms family relations, how that transforms gender and love and lots of other things. Many of the characters are trans, I think a majority of them. And so there's a lot of rich things about gender throughout the book. The second oral history is about the liberation of Palestine, and a quite magnificent story. And importantly, the revolution really starts elsewhere and then eventually makes it to New York. And yeah, and the reception of the book has been really quite wonderful. We've had a magnificent time speaking at bookstores and universities and study groups. And that has really helped me kind of both understand and affirm a lot of my interest in writing it, that the book is not prophecy, it's not a blueprint for what people should do. I think in many ways my politics as a communist, as I understand it, is somewhat adverse to the idea that I could dictate a kind of way forward to other people, but that speculation, imagining, is a really very powerful part of our movements, and it's something that we should all do all the time. That whenever we are talking in struggle, we are organizing together, we are making a protest happen, we are implying revolutionary horizons. And the George Floyd rebellion was very helpful in illuminating this, how the abolition of police went from a relatively marginal concept amongst Black revolutionaries and some communists and anarchists and others, to becoming something that like tens of thousands of teenagers were talking about and arguing about. And how incredible that was, the sort of watching this kind of revolutionary idea being taken up on a large scale, as a imagining of the future, right? It's not a clear blueprint. It's not clear exactly what the next steps are. It's an evocation of a possibility that we then get to argue about with each other and learn about and think about together. And so that writing this book really came out of that intent, really wanting to welcome everyone to write a revolutionary science fiction novel that kind of extrapolates from what we care about in the present and the kind of work that we do in the present.
I love this. I don't lack stimulation of and that and that and that. So let me just pause at one of those moments. Today, unless it's been resolved, the nurses in New York City at several hospitals are on strike. And one of the things they're striking for is a better ratio of care. There's too few of them to do this really important work. And so some in this webinar will have read your book already, and some will have not yet. So spoiler alert, I'm going to be sharing some things that happened there. One thing that happened was there was an occupation of a hospital in, I think, Elmhurst, Crotona, perhaps, I forget the name, but in Elmhurst Hospital, there was so much had shut down this might have been somewhere between 52 and 72. So much had shut down that people couldn't get care because they weren't able to pay for care. How absurd is that? You have to pay for care. But it was occupied by the nurses and the doctors and the carers, and people got care. And some of that stimulation or communication even happened with things that were happening when I read it in the book at Borough Manhattan Community College with some assemblies, and people were talking about how do we occupy. And another thing that's in the lived experience of many people in our social justice world, and certainly at SLU, is they have the lived memories of Occupy Wall Street. So I wanted to sort of ask you to talk either about that piece about the hospitals and what that means when these stories come up and you're interviewing some people that you imagine, but the conversations back and forth are very rich. What are some things that they learned?
Yeah, thank you, Rebecca, for that question. We effectively, one of the sort of core ideas of the book is that we already intuitively know what to do, right? That we actually keep doing it over and over. And the only reason that it doesn't work is because, the people that we're fighting against, the people who profit from returning us to the sort of like nonsensical system that we live in, keep winning. But that these efforts, right? The idea that we know how to run things in equitable ways, right? We know how to provide for each other. We know how to take care of each other. Any of us who have, as you say, who have the memory of street occupations, of protests, of protest camps, or even of mutual aid efforts after major disasters, know that people intuitively know how to take care of each other, not just intuitively, but have built this knowledge that keeps coming up and getting built on in each of these moments. And so what we imagine in the book is a set of circumstances in which people do it again, just like we always have and always will. But this time we win because the circumstances are such that the other side can't defeat us. And so that's exactly what happens in the hospital occupation that's in the book. The character that's referenced that works at this hospital was in another hospital that got shut down when the city government was stronger and was more in control. And when that government, and then started working at another hospital, and then in the second time around, there's this different set of circumstances in the city in which they're no longer able to shut down the occupation, and the workers seize the means of care and provide it for the population.
I love that. And because Juan Gonzalez had just spoken about the young lords in the Bronx, there was a story of the occupation of Lincoln Hospital in 1970 that started. Go ahead, Emmy.
Yeah, so I both of you are alluding to the ways that the book is sort of woven into current and historical struggles. So very much the hospital occupation was shaped in part by being inspired by the Lincoln Hospital, the People's Detox, the Lincoln Hospital takeover that happened as a collaboration between the Young Lords and the Health Revolutionary Union movement and other, the Black Panthers and other revolutionary organizations in New York, fighting around the abysmal medical care that the city provided to working class people of color in the Bronx, and helped establish the city's first detox program. And I moved to New York City to work at a syringe exchange program in the South Bronx that was really deeply influenced by that history. There was some links between, considerable links between the syringe exchange and harm reduction movements in New York City and former Young Lords organizing through the 1990s and 2000s. We had acupuncturists who were trained at the acupuncture program that was established during the People's Detox occupation. And I was working in a neighborhood in Hunts Point that becomes the basis of the first oral history with Miss Kelly, where sex workers participate and play a leading role in the takeover of the produce market there that ends up feeding the revolutionary struggle in New York. And that was inspired in part by watching and hearing about sex worker organizing, both when I was working in Hunts Point and then more recently in the Decrim New York struggle, and then also shaped in part by the strike that happened at Hunts Point just a couple of years ago. And so, you know, these New York has such an incredible and rich history of struggle and so many different movements that intersect within the geography, the space of our lives, and that have really helped create what is magnificent and incredible about New York that, you know, real estate and finance and police are always trying to destroy. And we wanted to evoke that in the book. That the book reflects our deep love of New York and our deep love of the incredible legacy of multiracial working class movements here.
This is so helpful, and I want to invite people to start using the Q&A function and put some questions there we could talk about. Love, joy, sex, dancing, all of this is spoken and told through people's stories as part and parcel of the new world. And I thought of Emma Goldman. I don't want to, if I can't dance, I don't want to be in your revolution. But also part of how we manage loving each other while we are grieving. So much loss, which is really already a pandemic on our planet. And I think humanity always, you don't live without loss, it comes. And so all of these losses that start to be so huge, some of the different strategies that people seem to sort of use, whether it's creating the commune, taking each other in, figuring out ways to have family. Maybe you can talk about any of that in terms of how people show up for each other, as you said, Iman.
Emmy has a lot of interesting things to say about collective grief, so I want her to answer.
Sure. So the book is quite, it's joyful and it's hopeful, but it also has a lot of grief, a lot of pain that you alluded to, that the 2040s were really quite horrific time. And that was about the sort of social crisis around ecology, around health, around the decay of government services, around the intensification of rapacious capitalism, the escalation of fascism. And there's no single catastrophe, there's no apocalypse. There's just many catastrophes that are very much like the catastrophes that we are seeing right now all over the world, just gotten worse, as they are likely to do. And the revolution kind of emerges out of people's response to this, how people struggle against this and struggle to survive in the midst of it. And we were, that's a lot of the book. So someone called our book a post-traumatic utopia, that there's a lot of characters who are highly traumatized. And a couple are still in their traumas, right? Like they're in flashbacks, overwhelmed during the interviews themselves, while other people have a lot to say about their healing trajectories and how they heal individually, but also a lot around collective healing, around trying to create the collective spaces within the communes for a kind of shared grieving together. We just finishing up a short story that was commissioned that a man was the lead author on, and conceived of this thinking about this large scale grieving ritual. And that came out of a lot of our discussions around the book. And writing it during the pandemic, a lot of it during the pandemic, it was so, the pandemic hit New York so hard, right? I think we all know people who died. There were sirens all the time. I live close to SUNY Downstate Hospital, and there were trucks filled with corpses, refrigerator trucks outside. Like, the scale of death was really quite incredible, quite devastating. And by and large, like, we have all pretended like it never happened, right? That I have never been invited to a grieving ritual related to COVID. I've never heard about one before it happened, only after. So, like, sure, people are doing things, but really, as a society, we live in so much denial about this level of loss. And part of what we wanted to imagine in the book is the social conditions that could enable people to begin to hold and recognize and actually work through the devastation of what we're all in the middle of losing in our lives.
I appreciate that. I think of a character, you'll know who she is, an elder woman. I'm trying to remember which chapter it was in, where she was, and elders in the 2060s are people who are young now. I mean, that's really helpful for us to like look at who, right? So I think she was like born around the turn of the century, right? She was very isolated and suffering a lot, but she sewed. And she ended up sewing. You'll remember that she ended up sewing tents with all kinds of fabric, and the tents became these spaces for assemblies. I wonder if you want to talk about that character and a little bit about how through bringing back a craft skill, which I think is really important for part of how we get through things when there is, well, for a lot of reasons, both as an art, but also as we need to make things. She was making tents. And it became a healing space for her. She now entered the assembly and was part of the groups rather than isolated in her home. Do you want to talk about that character or that context at all?
Sure. So the interview was with Tanya John on the Free Assembly of Crotona Park. And the Free Assembly was a pivotal moment in the revolution. And it was all the armed revolutionary factions of New York City coming together to argue for a month about what they were trying to build together. And so mostly street gangs, but a huge variety of other people as well. And so she's a DJ both before and after, and the dance parties that she organized became really central to the kind of cohesion that enabled the assemblies to take place. And you're alluding to her aunt. So this is page 70, if people have a copy. She says, I can tell you about my aunt. She kind of stands out for me as a neighborhood person who's changed by this process. My aunt wasn't old, like maybe she was in her 60s when the Crotona Assembly happened. So maybe she was born in the 90s, the 80s. I'm not sure. She was too scared to leave her home. It had been so bad for her for a long time. She was scared of diseases and getting shot in crossfire and a lot of other things. I think she probably had schizophrenia, but you could carry on a conversation with her easily. And actually, all her fears were well-founded, like they were things that happened to people all the time. She had this little apartment she had been in for 40 years at Murphy Houses on Crotona Avenue. I know my mom would scrounge for groceries for her through the 40s, and then after Hunts Point, the takeover alluded to earlier, I would bring her building food there once a week. I say, it sounds like she was very isolated. And she responds, definitely. I got it into my head to get her roped into the assembly planning. She started leaving her house for planning meetings. My aunt was really into sewing. She had trained as a tailor when she was younger, and an old boyfriend of hers had this industrial sewing machine. So she got a group of old women to sew our meeting tents. Like initially, that was just joining tarps to make bigger tarps, but then they started making them more and more elaborate, like these huge patterns of stars and street maps, and everything cut out of tarps and trash fabrics, and even leaves from trees. Then she ended up working with some Latin kins, one of the OG street orgs she had always been terrified of. The kins took on getting the metal poles and erecting the tents. It was wild watching her control her panic attacks and then go into these meetings with kids a third of her age and tell them how the tents were designed. I say, that sounds really moving. John replies, it gets better. I remember when the tents went up and we all stood under them and looked up at these beautiful patterns above us, like an old cathedral. Her face just lit up, and it was like the new world belonged to her too. It wouldn't leave her behind. She made something so magical. People coming to the assembly commented on how beautiful they were. The Crotona commune still sets them up in the park for special occasions. Through connecting to the Crotona around that process, my aunt started getting better mental health care, started eating with other people, and lived the last part of her life connected to other people. I say, that's a great story. What is her name? Abigail John. She passed away last year.
Here's to Abigail. There are so many different aspects of this that come up for me. Earlier in that chapter, they talk about the Crotona Assemblies, and there's a quote that I decided is one of my favorites: is dancers were the neurons of the new mind. And really bringing up that in these assemblies, when we were dealing with conflict and we had to work on a lot of conflict, there was also a lot of dance and joy as a way to be neurons for that. So in one of the classes that I teach, it's called Cooperative Management for a Changing World. And it's supposed to be, how do you manage each other more cooperatively? And we talk about all the ways of facilitation and group process and conflict resolution as, here are tools we need. But what I see when I read the book is the tools are becoming more and more common. Like right now in the 2020s, we're like hoping to get more of those tools under our belt. Talk a little bit about how those tools work. You talked about facilitation being a really important job, the assemblies being a critical component. Do you want to speak at all about those aspects of sort of group process, but a revolutionary way?
Yeah, so I think that, this relates to what we were talking about earlier about sort of jumping off from the experiences that a lot of us who have been involved in organizing have, right? That these experiences that think about democracy and collective action, as different than just the sort of ballot box idea that we have, right? As kind of iterative processes in which we're in conversation with each other, and we have conflict, and we work through those conflicts. So, we don't manage to get rid of meetings after the revolution. I'm sorry to bring that news to everyone. We don't manage to get rid of, huge assemblies, but because we're imagining a society that's not driven by the profit motive, there isn't as much of a push towards the kind of like blind efficiency of the sort of intensive need to pare down everything so that it's as efficient as possible, which is one of the imperatives of living under capitalism, right? So that we think of efficiency as a sort of moral good. And in this society, its efficiency can be helpful and it can be aimed for, but it is not the ultimate good. The ultimate good is the collective well-being. And so all of these tools, I mean, you have to really imagine all of the priorities of the society shifting, right? The sort of the end goals being very different from the ones that we have structured our current society and our lives around, which is the goal of profit and And so, and survival under a regime and the tyranny of profit. So, so I think that the tools are both emergent from these current experiences, but also are totally shifted by the revolutionary moment and the revolutionary context.
I'm reminded that, of course, today we talk about abolish the police, but you also abolish family, and you abolish, this future state abolishes money and really looks, and even abolishes work as a four-letter word, so to speak, and thinks much differently about production. So go for it, Emmy. I see.
And it kind of abolishes the state as well.
Yeah.
Depending on how you want to parse
a whole
it.
lot.
Yeah. Yeah, the
Yeah.
state is not a separate entity that rules over society. It's incorporated into the fabric of collective decision making and popular assemblies and online forums and the dynamics of the commune and all sorts of other things. It's not a state in any of the ways that we understand it. So I'll say a couple of words about family abolition. So I just wrote a book about family abolition. It's done. You can pre-order it right now. Called Family Abolition from Pluto. I'm making an index for it at the moment. And it's in some ways a kind of nonfiction counterpart to this book. Notably, a man wrote the chapter that has the most about sort of the transformation of family. But it's not that family has been mandated out of existence. It's not that people form partnerships, they have children, they live together in a variety of ways, they form complex family units regularly, but that family doesn't exist within the structure of a private household, which is really important, that it's within a sort of much larger commune system of hundreds of people that sort of emerge out of collective strategies of survival. Like, think of the protest kitchen as becoming the kind of basis for reorganizing neighborhoods. And because of that, there's no economic compulsion to the family at all. There's no way that who you choose to live with or love or related to has any bearing on your economic well-being. And the way Amanda writes about this is really profoundly moving. It's very, very striking. And that imagining that a revolution that transforms the economy, that transforms the state, that radically transforms how power works in society must also necessarily alter how we care for each other in intimate ways. And that in struggle historically and in struggle now, we can see some of the ways that collective social reproduction emerges in the midst of mass insurrection, mass protest, and these activities, collective social reproduction of cooking for each other and watching each other's kids and, spending, taking care of each other in a protest setting can then reflect a very different way of organizing society. And as the private family is really tied up with surviving within the capitalist economy, that as that economy is transformed, people can begin to form very different structures of kinship and care and love for each other. And so that's a theme that we really explore a lot in the book and are really interested in.
I'm going to start framing some of the questions for you. You don't have to look if you want to just listen. Where can people buy the book? I'll say, tell your local bookstore to order it. I've asked the library at the Graduate Center to order it. And Common Notions. Common Notions is a publisher, but I loved this little thing. Somewhere buried in the book, there was talk about an activity in Brooklyn where people were learning, this is in 2072, learning how to do printed books because Common Notions had a workshop on that. You want to say anything about that, or is that enough? It was such a...
I want to try to answer some of these webinar chats, questions, audience questions. So yes, Annie Schwartz, tell your local bookstore to order it. They'll also link for buying from the publisher if you'd like to.
Many local bookstores probably have it also.
Yeah. There's a lot about the environmental crisis. Yes, much of New York is underwater and in a flood zone. there's a chapter that really centers around ecological restoration at which it takes place at Reese Beach, which is being transformed into marshland after having been a military detention facility for a lot of the struggle. And so a lot about ecological crisis. And the book also acknowledges that New York is way behind in sort of really grappling with the meaning of ecological crisis, that it's become really one of the dominant themes globally and across North America, the kind of convergence of indigenous sovereignty, ecological restoration, and like mass collective participation. But New York is a little bit trying to catch up on it. There's one question here, Aman, about gestational surrogacy, reproductive technologies. Do you want to speak to that a little bit?
Sure. Are we doing this in order, or Rebecca, did you have ones?
My apologies.
Oh, no,
That's okay. You can go ahead.
okay. Yeah, so I see the question is about reproductive technology. Yeah, so I think that I think that the science is headed towards reproductive technology that breaks the so in the book we imagine that the science is moving in the direction, has moved in the direction that we are moving in now, which is one in which you would have you could transplant the reproductive technology. You could essentially you can transplant the reproductive technology in different bodies so that gender or sex, as we define it now, doesn't determine who can gestate and who can have a child. So that one could have a uterus transplanted, or a womb transplanted, and so it's a way to radically reimagine the links between gender and reproductive work. And so this is also, we as a gender scholar, I can say that, we punish mostly women, but anyone who can bear children, we punish them for their ability to do so while demanding that they do it, right? We effectively, we lower their wages, we make them more economically precarious. There's all these ways in which we essentially punish this work, and it's a big part of how we explain gender inequality. Even, and this is not necessarily even a radical perspective. This is like basic kind of bread and butter sociology. And so in the book, we imagine a world in which these things are unlinked, and also there isn't a punishment for care work in general. And so in the chapter that Emmy referenced earlier, people are really wanting to gestate, right? It's this thing that people are really excited about, and it's this seen as this lovely, sacred thing that people do because they really want to. And in fact, the character is a trans person who's part of their sadness is that they're unable to do this because of past trauma to their body. So I think that actually reimagining those relationships are one of the key kind of points of potential liberation in the book.
There's another question, might overlap, but it's about technology and how technological innovation gets integrated into the book. You imagine people going to outer space and colonizing. There's some things that may scare some of us as what's possible.
Not colonizing, hopefully. Hopefully they're doing something in outer space other than colonizing. Yeah.
Help me with the proper wording. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think so one of the key things is that technology is something that belongs to all of us. This is not an anti-tech future. This is a future in which we take back tech, right? Like thinking about space technology now, right? Almost all advances in space technology have been publicly funded. They are now the gains from them are now being privatized. However, they are a public product. All of science has been, most scientific advancements have been publicly funded. Pharmaceutical companies basically reap profits out of publicly funded research. And so this is a future in which we take that back. You know, we do tech, but we do tech, but we do it for the people. We don't do it under a profit motive. And I think this actually also speaks to your other question, a couple of other questions that have popped up about work, in which I think both Emmy and I believe, and Emmy, correct me if I'm speaking for you here, but believe that people do find a lot of fulfillment in work, right? Believe that like most people want to produce something in the world. And we imagine a world in which people are doing that, liberated from the economy, liberated from the idea that it would be fundamental to their survival in order to do so. And that opens up all these imaginative possibilities. So we really wrote up the things we were excited about. I was really excited about the space thing because I feel very passionate, as you might be able to tell from my tone of voice right now. I feel very passionate about the idea. You know, I get particularly angry when people talk about technological advancement as a feature, particularly of capitalism and a feature of the private market, because it's just not empirically. But I think that, you know, and Emmy wrote an incredible chapter, the Tanya John chapter, you know, where people are having dance parties on barges and reinventing the internet through mesh. And yeah, so and that's part of the incitement to write your own. I want to read about all the tech that all of our audience members want to imagine into the future.
Well, a few things that aren't even that future. There is something called NYC Mesh, and for no money, a few people can get on your rooftop and start to connect using a wireless mesh. People are seizing the means in NYC Mesh. Another seizing of the means that was referenced in the future was when the people who were working in the hospital needed medicine. They went down to Mississippi, where a pharmaceutical factory had been occupied. And we have in the coursework that we do in the certificate, Workplace Democracy and Community Ownership, we have different courses. We study some of the case studies around the globe of occupations and what does it mean when you seize the means. And there is a story in Chicago of New Era Windows that was occupied because the workers saw that the owner was extracting everything and claiming that they're going out of business, but they were putting themselves out of business and the owner's occupied. And so, you know, bringing that back up. And someone asked about George Jetson, that, you know, which I remember watching, and the Jetsons, and they had the 3-hour workday. Because, you know, if that's one way to look at when we increase our productivity to match what's possible with the help of technology, can that mean we work less? I think you've achieved that somewhere in different stories, that people are able to live more and work less.
I see that there was a question about whether our characters were composites of people we know, or were they invented from scratch? It says, are most of the characters composites of people you know, or are they invented from scratch? How do you create so many characters that feel perfectly authentic beyond your personal experiences?
Yeah.
I'll say quickly that I threw a lot of my friends' names in the books. I'm really bad at naming. It's a joke among my research assistants as an academic that like I can never come up with pseudonyms for my respondents. But I think in terms of personalities sometimes, but yeah, I think I tried to imagine myself doing an interview with this person and tried to kind of flesh out their personality, their tone of voice, that sort of thing. I did a speculative fiction writing workshop here in Chicago at some point, and that was a big part of the setup. You know, it was just like picturing an embodiment of this character. I'd be curious to hear Emmy's answer to this as well.
Well, in the New York City Trans Oral History Project, I interviewed a lot of different sorts of trans identified New Yorkers from diverse walks of life, and that you know, that is linked to the research project that I did on LGBTQ organizing capital in New York City, and my own history. And Amanda and I share a history of doing a lot of different types of social justice organizing. And so meeting a lot of people and the richness and complexity of people's lives and how they talk about it was a huge inspiration for this book. You know, that thinking about all these oral histories that I had transcribed or helped transcribe, and sort of the meaning that people make of their trajectory through New York. Like when people talk about New York, they're talking about racial capitalism, usually, the history of struggle and gentrification and poverty and all sorts of things in the city. And, like, certainly I've interviewed people that share some characteristics with people in the book, but not, they only to a vague extent. And there's a way that I wanted the characters to be able to become themselves, to like have a richness of their own that isn't just sort of extracted or stolen from people that I know. And that puts me in the difficult position of like giving voice to various marginalized individuals who in social groups that I don't belong to. And I hope that we did that well. We got some help. We hired some consultants to help out in thinking about language and whatnot. And I hope that we did so in a way that is resonant and respectful and compelling. Yeah, I mean, there's a character from Wind River Reservation in Wyoming who was a militant in the armed civil war that took place in the Midwest. There are characters who grew up as sex workers in the streets of Chelsea and the Bronx. There's groups, there's many, many, many life trajectories here. There's the ecological restoration chapter is a trans Chinese Canadian from Vancouver, who sort of grew up in a radical environmental scene, struggling with schizophrenia. We sort of went, the breadth of people reflects a little bit on what we have experienced in the breadth of New York City. Yeah, and hopefully we did it well. People seem to like it.
You do it well. I'm not going to remember this strongly, and I want to go back to it so you can tell me where it is. It had to do with the ecological restoration and a conflict with some indigenous people, which I know that like even restoring, like how do we restore? There's a lot of things to think about. What does it mean to do ecological restoration? Is that another form of invasion? And I'm curious what that conflict, if you want to say more about that, because not only do you talk about it, but it's also how the assembly handled it, the conversations for this conflict.
Sure, it's kind of referenced as a broad backdrop in a couple of stories. But that kind of, I think a kind of key political question in revolutionary movements is both how to overcome the violence of nationalism and nation states and sort of like clear divisions between people in a vision of collective management, collective ownership, collective solidarity. So that as a deep commitment of communism. And then on the other hand, recognizing the really deep violence of settler colonialism and part of what that has meant in robbing people of like that as that there's no just future for North America without undoing settler colonialism and the deep entitlement of that white people and control white people exert over the land, and taking indigenous sovereignty very seriously as a fundamental principle. And so like, how do these things mesh? That everything is held in common on the one hand, and on the other hand, that indigenous people need to have a level of control over the use of the land and the future of the land. And that the book references an extended process that got tense at times, that got ugly at times, occasionally got violent, but that was sort of kept managed, that unfolded within the revolutionary movement and within the assemblies around how to navigate that relationship, how to navigate indigenous sovereignty and a commitment around collective ownership. And that we sort of did our best to try to think about socially just ways that could play out. And that this is, reflects a kind of broader set of questions for how to struggle with contradictions among the people, that the deep history of violence requires us to make really close, attentive, and committed work around undoing that, around creating alternative strategies of survival and solidarity. Yeah, I could say more, but we're short on time.
We're short on time, but because of the problem with the extra logging in, I'm going to take a couple more minutes if there's more questions. I want to ask you about this. So is 50 years enough time? I started by referencing back 50 years. I remember the occupation, the first occupation the Young Lords did in Lincoln Hospital. I was a young kid being raised in sort of some social justice space, and it was like, look at that, look at that. That's only 50 years ago. We didn't quite do it. 50 years from now, you say there really could be. And I think partly what I take is because there's been such exponential catastrophes and struggles that a lot can happen in 50 years. So let me just ask you, what were some pivotal things that happened in the next 50 years that helped us make this happen sooner? Because the other thing is, as the Haudenosaunee suggests, 7 generations. And I could see almost being a planner for 7 generations, right? Let's plan, what are we going to do in the next generation, the one after that? But this was unplanned. So,
well, you know, a core thesis of the book is that the state needs to fall for capitalism to fall effectively, because it bolsters capitalism. It does the dirty work, you know. And, you know, I'm 33 and I am seeing the American state, but also other very strong states fail increasingly in ways that I would never have imagined, even, you know, in my childhood. And so even in that like relatively short, in the historical time frame, even in that relatively short period, I think we have been seeing, exactly as you said, an accelerated rate of state failure, and an inability. And I think it's because the crises keep on coming. I wouldn't have imagined that there would be tens of thousands of people in an American city who don't have access to clean water for multiple days. Like, if you had told me that that would happen in my relatively early adulthood, I would have been like, what? No, you know, or like, you know, so I think that the state is already having a hard time keeping up with the rate of crisis. And so this imagines this accelerating more and more and more, you know, with accelerating climate crisis and, you know, the overheating of global capitalism. And so, so, you know, the things that happen in the next 50 years is, you know, I think this is what makes our book, you know, it is utopic in many ways, but it's also dystopic in many ways, because there's a lot of bad shit that happens, to put it, you know, mildly. So essentially we would have, you know, there would be, we imagine multiple huge pandemics, quite a bit of war, you know, basically kind of the fall of the modern nation state. Yeah.
would you want to say a word of how Palestine becomes a tipping point? I know we're low on time, so I'm throwing.
Yeah, I mean, so part of it's an extension of the theory that I just mentioned, which is that the states that fail first are the states that are weakest. And so we imagine the revolution effectively starting in the Levant, where you have some of the world's weakest states now. And so we think, so Palestine becomes a tipping point because it's in a region in which there's all these failing nation states, and people are fed up with not getting their end of the sort of social contract, right? Not getting any of the stability, not getting the food, not getting the shelter. And so you start to have the kind of collapse of the current order and the emergence of a new one in the context of the Levant, and the liberation of Palestine is a huge part of that of that trajectory. And it's a tipping point much in the way that it is now, right? As like the, you know, the occupation.
Right. I love to see it all as the emergent strategy. We hearken to some of the work of Adrienne Marie Brown, looking at what's the emergent strategy, what are the tipping points, how do you go with it rather than resist it. Some of the talk of failing forward is even something to say, don't be afraid of failure. You know, state, don't be afraid of failure. It's okay. You know, there is life after you. So we're out of time. I want to thank you so much. If either of you want to say some closing words, I want to invite that, and then we'll close with an appreciation.
Thank you so much for having us for this wonderful discussion. I thank you to all our audience members, and I'm sorry if we missed your questions. Please feel free to reach out. You can always, I think Emmy and I both, do the Twitter thing, so you're welcome to reach out to us there. I'm Iman Abdelhadi, at Iman Abdelhadi on Twitter. Yeah, and thank you so much.
It's wonderful. Emmy?
Yeah, it was our pleasure. It was our honor to be here. I really enjoyed it. And at Gender Horizon on Twitter. And yeah, I hope to have the opportunity to be in conversation with a lot more of you in future events.
Well, I really appreciated this. I've loved your book. I hope everybody here tells other people and you read it. We'll be talking about it in my classes, and what a privilege it is to bring the future into this current space.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Michael and Nadia for being behind the scenes, helping everything flow. Much appreciation. Thank you, everybody, for coming.